Hello, this is Alaina Chan, and today we will be using every blue art supply that I own to create a traditional art piece. I started off with my watercolors, and I really should have wet down the whole page before I started putting the blue on, but I did want to make sure that I laid down the watercolors as the base for the color all the way down, and I knew that I would be covering up some of it, but I wanted to make sure that the whole page was blue instead of white. First, I used my unnamed, not branded watercolors, and then I moved on to my Crayola watercolors. After that, I let the paint dry for a couple of hours, and then I came back with my acrylic paints. I first started with a fine brush for the acrylic paint, but then realized that I didn't need to do that in this moment, and got out one of my thicker paint brushes to create kind of a hill shape on one side, and then I went to my other acrylic color and I decided to work on the base layer for the ocean in the background. I didn't have a lot of blue acrylic paints. I only had two shades. So this is the lighter of the two, and it also went down onto the page very thick, very opaque, which I really liked. The second acrylic paint that I have is an Utrecht. I think that's how you say it. Acrylic paint. And that one is a lot more sheer. So when I was putting it down initially, I was using it to make sure that I got the outline of mist first. And then I didn't realize that I was doing it too high for a second there. And then once I had already gotten one side of mist, I was like, oops. Oh well. So that's a little bit funny that that's left in the art piece because there's not really a way that I could think of to make the acrylic paint not be there after I had put it down initially. But honestly, that's okay. I think it helps her stand out a little bit more later on in the piece. As you can see, I'm using the thinner paintbrush to really figure out where some of the line art was because the watercolor ended up covering up the blue sketch that I had done underneath it a lot more than I thought it would. And I also wanted to make sure that I wasn't going outside of the area or into the area where the characters were supposed to be, because I knew that I would be using other art supplies that weren't as opaque, like the Ohuhu markers, later on, so I wanted to make sure that I wasn't being too heavy-handed with the acrylic paint. I end up covering this up later, but I did try mixing the two acrylic paints together to see if I could create a third shade of the blue acrylic to cover up the area for the other hill. I didn't end up liking the color because I felt like it looked too much like the water. Here you can see that I have pulled out my posca marker and I am putting one of the lighter colors onto where the acrylic paint was after it had dried, just to change the color so that it didn't look too much like the water. And I knew that this was an art supply that I could put on top of the acrylic paint and it would cover because it's another form of acrylic paint, so that's good. I also felt like I had a lot more control with the Posca pen than I do with a paintbrush, but I think that just comes with feeling more familiar with markers. Once I had worked on that part, I then started seeing where I could add in some of the other markers. At first I was thinking I'd do some grass on the hills, but then I thought that I could do a different supply for that later. So I decided to put in some waves in the ocean. I'm not sure I fully like how this turned out. I think I would have liked to do something a little bit different next time. But I think for what it is, it looks okay. And it is something that I use in digital art media, but then I end up doing things like blurring it or using something else to make the water look a little bit more like shades of color rather than big globs of lines. As you can see, I'm pulling up and down the page to look at my swatches on the other side so that I can figure out which color I want to use for the individual parts of my characters and their outfits and all that good stuff. And right here, I'm coloring my character Wisteria. She's a Warforged Bard. Wisteria and my character who's on the other side is Mist are both very blue. So I thought that they would be great subjects for this piece since they need a lot of blue to be colored in anyway. I started with Wisteria's hair because it was a nice big chunk of color that I could put down first, and then I worked on Mist next. Mist is a water Genasi Druid, by the way. It was kind of awkward to move around that acrylic paint in the place where it wasn't supposed to be, but it did end up being a good line so that I knew to stop there and not go over too far. Once I started putting on the Ohuhu markers, you can see where the sketch was from before, and I don't really mind that because you can kind of see what the characters were looking like from their sketches. Both Mist and Wisteria have some green accents to their outfits as well, so I do have some blues in here that ended up looking a lot more green than I thought they would. But I'm glad that I have the colors that are a little bit more green because it does help differentiate some different pieces. Like Mist has a lily pad in her hair, and Wisteria does have a dress that has green sleeves on it. When I was swatching these colors, the colors that ended up looking as green as they do weren't that green when I swatched them. I think it's just putting all these blues together that makes it look so green at the end. The markers that I'm using are a mixture of Ohuhu markers. I have two sets. I have the Ohuhus that have the bullet nib and the chisel nib. And then I do have a set of Ohuhu liners that have a brush tip on one end and the fine liner nib on the other. I also have a giant pack of Crayola water-based markers that I was using. With the Crayolas and the Ohuhus, I wasn't trying to use one before the other. I just was grabbing the colors that I wanted or needed at the moment for the piece and was putting them down on the paper as I needed them. I really wanted to make sure that I put down all the wet art supplies, since in the past when I have been putting down some of the dry or wax based art supplies, it's really hard to put the liquid art supplies on top. So I was really able to stick to that this time, and I feel like the piece came together a lot better, and it wasn't as difficult to put down the supplies or shade or do any of those things, and I'm really proud of myself for being able to stick to that this time and not go too crazy with the supplies I was using and not paying attention to what was going where on the page. There were so many blue art supplies that I just had to figure out where to put them. Luckily, I got all of the base colors down pretty well and I thought they looked nice, but then I was kind of going back and forth and looking at the different colors and figuring out where I could put those as well. I did end up adding a lot more streaks and trying to add depth to both of my girls' hair, and I feel like that did really work in my favor. I was also trying to use some of the markers to add some depth to the water. On some places you can see it, and in others, once it's dry, you can't really see it at all. So I don't think it was a very good use of the art supplies. I think I would have rather added more depth to the hair or probably added shading to the sky or something somehow instead. I think that would have been a little bit better of a way to use the art supplies, but honestly, I got all of them down on the paper, so I'm kind of glad about that. Once I finished using all of my wet art supplies, I moved on to my colored pencils, crayons, and pastels. I started with the colored pencils because I really wanted to make sure that I had line art for everything and wanted to feel like everything looked good with the line art. And I think the line art went really well. I think it did really help, especially with the characters against the sky, to really stand out. And I also used my colored pencils to do some other things, like add some more depth to the hair on top of what the markers did. I really think the colored pencils looked great layered on top of both the water-based markers and also the alcohol-based markers. Here you can see that I'm adding a lot of different waves. I tried to go along where the hair was moving because both of them have pretty curly or wavy hair texture. And I had so much fun adding in the darker shades to Wisteria because her hair does have a lot darker and muted tones to it, where Wisteria's is more of a bright blue. I did used to use a similar technique with coloring the hair and adding different colored strands throughout the hair and going along with the hair texture and movement back in the day with digital art. And I stopped doing it mostly because I really like how a big, clear shape of color looks with my art better than this. But I think for a traditional art style, this does work pretty well. and I would definitely consider doing it again once I move on to my purple or pink art supplies. And then once I finished with their hair and didn't think they really needed any more texture to the hair, I decided I wanted to add some little grass pieces to my little hills. I'm not super happy about how the grass looks. I think it could have looked a lot better if I had done some different techniques with it. I also could have done a different shape for the grass, and that might have looked better too. But I think overall it was a success in being able to get down all of the colored pencils and crayons and stuff that I used. I use the crayons a lot more for shading, especially underneath the hair and making the different pieces of hair look like they were on top of each other. And here you can see I'm breaking out the pastels, and it went better on top of the Posca marker than it did on just the straight acrylic paint. And overall, I had a lot of fun making this piece. Thank you so much for coming along and watching the process of me making this traditional piece today. And I'll see you again next time. Bye!